high definition. This is KCAL 9 News at 2.
Well, creating a life you love is just a few words away.
Joining us in the studio this afternoon with some talk tips is communication expert Josselyn Herman-Saccio. Thanks for being with us.
Thank you so much for having me.
I kind of like the sound of this.
Yeah, right?
But you got to explain it to me because I don't get it yet.
Well, the first thing to get is that language is very powerful, especially if you understand that there are two types of language. There's the kind of language that describes, like I could describe your sweater or this desk, and then there's the kind of language that creates. So as a communication expert with Landmark Education, we focus on that kind of communication and that kind of language since we want to create a life you love. And if you look at the latest neuroscience studies, it actually proves that the impact of language is inescapable on how we view our lives and how we interact with life. So we have a simple but very powerful three-step process to bring to any area of your life that's important to you.
Oh, great.
So just think of something that's important to you.
Okay.
And the first step is to distinguish the facts from the interpretation you have about the facts. So now you could use... Yeah, here we go. I know, people think their interpretation are the facts. So if you take money, for example, and you could do this with relationships or anything, but money is kind of something we all have in common, and it's sort of a topical issue right now. So if you take money, there are facts about your money. There are facts like how much you owe, how much you make, what you spend, your interest rates, all that, right? Then there's the interpretation you have about those facts. Like, oh, I don't have enough money, or I have plenty of money. I wish I had that interpretation.
Well, I really have to spend it on that when you really don't have to,
Exactly,
right?
Those shoes. It's always the shoes, isn't it?
Well, that's a necessity sometimes.
Exactly. So there's the interpretation. So you separate out the facts from the interpretation. Then the next step is to actually know yourself and get clear about what you're committed to. So I could give a personal example from my life about my grandma. I had a story about my grandma that she was mean, okay? And she was scary. And I used to call her because I wanted to be a good granddaughter. And I would say, "Hi, Grandma, how are you?" And she'd say, "How would you know? You never call me." And I'd be like, so that was sort of the story. Now, when I did the first step and I distinguished the facts from the story, I got clear about what I was committed to with my grandmother was having a great relationship with her. So I called her and I said, "How are you?" And she said, "How would you know? You never call me." And instead of thinking she's mean like that's true, I separated it. And I said, okay, that's not what's happening. What's happening is she's saying I don't call her. And I said, "You're right, I haven't called you in a really long time. How are you?" She said, "I'm fine, how are you?" And it was like over in that second. And for the next 16 years, we spoke 4 to 5 times a week and had a best friend kind of relationship. Which brings me to the third step, most important step, okay, is you've got to actually discover the unrealized potential of language by creating in your calendar action steps to fulfill on what's important to you. So with regard to my grandma, it was putting in my calendar to call her more often. Or with regard to your money, it could be calling your mortgage broker to see if you can get a lower interest rate. So if you do those 3 steps, you can get language working for you to create a life you love.
It would seem as though it might be difficult to get that distinguish.
That's a
step
tough
down.
one for some
Because,
people.
like they say, perception is reality.
Well, that's exactly why language has such an impact on our relationship to life, because how we perceive is through language. And if we can actually start to examine the language we're using to describe the facts in our life, we can start to have some access to creating interpretations that are more empowering than the ones we have.
Right.
So aside from that, what would you say is the biggest mistake that most people make?
Thinking that what they think is real. Thinking that, you know,
we're back to
grandma's
step
mean.
one.
It is. It's
If we can get over step 1, the other stuff might be a little bit easier.
Well,
right?
I think that if you get clear about what the facts are, it's easy to see what you're committed to. I think that your story clouds your commitment and has you kind of living in a why things aren't happening rather than what you really want. If you can focus on what you want, then you can be freed up to take action. But if you're focusing on why you don't have what you want, you can't possibly be looking at what actions could produce what you want.
Are there tips for doing that? Tips for seeing things for what they are rather than what you think they might be?
Yeah, I would actually get into a conversation with someone else because sometimes you're not the best judge of what's happening. So I would look at, okay, what are the facts about? Do you have a specific situation in mind, Dave? I know you have some.
Let's put you on the spot, Dave.
No, I'm pretty much perfect.
Oh, yeah, well, there you go. Well, maybe dealing with your perfection and the reaction of other people to your perfection, okay?
There you go.
There are the facts, like you are perfect, and then there's the story you have about those facts. Like people just don't like that, right? So looking at what actually is the facts, it could, with body image or with anything having to do with your career, your boss, these are the facts. I weigh this much. And then you have an interpretation. those facts aren't necessarily connected to those interpretations in reality. They're connected by virtue of how we think. And if we can separate out the meanings, we can start to loosen the grips of those meanings.
Well, I can see where this would really work out when you're looking at relationships, whether it's personal relationships or, you know, people at work, your boss. I mean,
totally. Even your employees. I mean, people who work with you. I mean, it's unbelievable. If you can actually start to relate to what's happening as distinct from your story, you have a lot of power to actually impact what's happening.
Yeah, that's great.
Power of
I get it now.
language to create a life you love. Very interesting.
All right, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you
really
so
appreciate
much.
it. 1, 2, 3. Just 3 steps. We could do it.
Co-worker.